Now, I just want to begin before the history of Juneteenth to share a little bit about my personal history and the role of United Methodist women in my personal history and professional ministry. When I was a young student at Yale Law School, I walked into the library, the Sterling Law Library. And as I was walking in, I looked up and saw on a bulletin board an African-American woman with curly hair, wearing glasses, and a clerical collar. That image was incredibly evocative for me, but I didn't quite understand why. I walked over to the librarian's desk and I asked, "Who is that woman?" And I was told her name was Paulie Murray. Paulie Murray, of course, got her start in part after graduating number 1 in her class at Howard University Law School, after betting her professors that Jim Crow could be defeated in 10 years. She got her start, if you will. She was brought to fame, if you will, because of United Methodist women. Why? Because in 1948, United Methodist Women, the women's division of the Methodist Church, contracted, if you will, Paulie Murray to write a pamphlet on segregation laws in the United States. She turned that pamphlet into a 746-page book. Now, the reason why this is so critically important is because that book on the the segregation laws of the states provided the roadmap, created the roadmap for Brown versus Board of Education. That is to say, the constitutional and moral declaration that separate is inherently unequal. So in other words, the United Methodist Church, through Methodist women, put Paulie Murray on the legal map, on the legal landscape. And so as a student walking into the Sterling Law Library, glimpsing the countenance of this powerful Black woman who became not only a superb lawyer, not only a stellar poet, not only the first African-American woman Episcopal priest, but also an Episcopal saint. So in many ways, this woman who inspired my journey as a civil rights lawyer got her start among United Methodist women. So vicariously, I come to you today as someone deeply in debt to your moral lineage, your moral legacy, your ministry lineage, and your ministry legacy. And so I have to begin with this word of gratitude for inspiring that student long ago in the Sterling Law Library of Yale Law School, that other law school to the south of the law school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I just wanted to begin with that word of appreciation. Now, I was asked by Michelle just to lift up a few words about Juneteenth. I do so having some appreciation, some understanding for United Methodist women as emissaries of the gospel, as ambassadors of social justice, as messengers of Christ in a broken world. I do so understanding that we, in this moment, are not gathered as a matter of coincidence, not gathering as a matter of happenstance, but literally find ourselves on not a random moment, not a happenstance moment or a coincidental moment on the Gregorian calendar, but we find ourselves convening in this moment at a morally poignant and historically significant point in time. Why? Because only a few days ago, we honored the fallen in this country on Memorial Day. And we understand that Memorial Day began as Decoration Day. We understand that women played a prominent and critical role in honoring the dead, honoring the fallen, going back to the days of the Civil War. So we understand that this moment that we find ourselves in follows Memorial Day. It also follows Flag Day. Flag Day, a day in which we honor, yes, a bit of colored cloth, as in red, white, and blue, but we understand that this colored cloth is not so much a matter of of color and cloth, but service and sacrifice. In other words, when we think about the flag in terms of people not only fighting on battlefields, but also fighting for social justice. When we think about people like John Lewis carrying the American flag on a march, on a demonstration, when we think about the heroes and heroines, the people who fight for our rights and for the advancement of social justice in our time, who seek the realization of the social gospel in this moment, we can honor that flag. But we find ourselves in the wake of Memorial Day, in the wake of Flag Day, yet with the 4th of July yet before us as we commemorate Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth is critically important for us as Christians because we are ever mindful of the Exodus story. We're ever mindful of the passage of God's people from the bondage of slavery into the relative freedom of the wilderness and into the promised land. We're mindful of the fact that when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln in September of 1862, providing a modicum of freedom on January 1st, 1863 for those enslaved persons in states under Confederate control. That meant, of course, much of the Southeast, but it also included Texas. And we recall that from history that it took the news, if you will, of freedom many months, well over a year, to reach, those persons who were enslaved in the state of Texas. We recall that General Gordon issued Field Order 3, declaring immediately the freeing of those persons who were literally still enslaved while others were freed. In other words, when African Americans in South Carolina and Georgia understood that they were in fact free, those in Texas were not yet free until they got the news. But now here's what is so powerful and what speaks to us in this moment. We understand that almost immediately, African Americans began to commemorate and to celebrate their freedom. And I want to just note here, not parenthetically, but essentially, the importance of women in the celebration of freedom. Here's what we note. Historians tell us that upon receiving the news, women literally adorned themselves in the wardrobe of freedom. Women literally went into the closets of their former masters and mistresses and literally took not merely house dresses, but also gowns, also ribbons, also jewelry. They adorned themselves, they decorated themselves in the wardrobe of freedom. Not only this, historians tell us that women took ribbon and tied ribbon in the hair of that their children might know that they were in fact free people. And so from the beginning, women played an incredible role in terms of literally commemorating and recognizing and memorializing this journey toward freedom. Historians also tell us that women played a prominent role in terms of designing parades and pageants and reenactments of history. Women were responsible for programs, Emancipation Day programs, Juneteenth programs, in which some African Americans portrayed masters and mistresses, others portrayed freed people, that they might engage, if you will, in a docudrama, as Hosea Williams described, a socio-docudrama of freedom. And so, in other words, women did not trust the historians of the day to tell the story. They did not trust the scholars of the day to simply tell the story. They told the story. They reenacted the story. In other words, these women understood that there's a Passover tradition. In other words, the Passover does not merely dryly, antiseptically, objectively chronicle the story of the Israelites from Egypt into the wilderness, into the promised land, they understood that this was a matter of enactment. In other words, they had to act out the parts. They had to pass down the dialogue. They had to paint the picture. They had to provide the scenery that the children might know, that their forebears, I should say, their descendants might know of the securing of freedom. This is critically important. Not only that, the history tells us that from 1940 to the 1970s or more, that literally thousands, millions of African Americans left the South and traveled all across the United States in the Great Migration, as so well described by the scholar Isabel Wilkerson. They sought, in her words, invoking the words of Langston Hughes, the warmth of other suns. But when they traveled, they took the story of Juneteenth with them. So this story of celebrating, commemorating, memorializing our freedom was literally taken across the country through our folklore, through our oral tradition, literally across the length and breadth of our republic. And why is that important? In this social media age in which so many of us communicate through Black Twitter, if we were to think of the Great Migration, if you will, as a Black Twitter with Black bodies, Black folklore, Black stories, Black drama, Black reenactment, in a way that spoke to the country and yet speaks to the country, women are critically important. Why? Because it's not merely about what the women did then. Let us take note of this gathering today. When does this gathering occur? It occurs in the wake of the House and the Senate passing legislation to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Who was a co-sponsor of this legislation? None other than Sheila Jackson Lee, a woman, a congresswoman from Texas. The point being here is that the tradition is ongoing. The legacy is being lived out in the present moment. Now, I just want to lift up, as preachers are wont to do, just a few, I won't even call them lessons, observations about this holiday. I just want to note here that Juneteenth, if we honor the history, if we honor what so many women and so many have done over the years and the decades, that Juneteenth is not so much a holiday off as it is a Sabbath on for social justice. It's not a holiday off. It is in fact a Sabbath on for social justice. If we think about the fact that the legislative body, that is to say the United States, which commendably passed this legislation on a unanimous basis, that same legislative body, in over a year since George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, that same legislative body has not yet taken action on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That suggests to us that there is work to do. Why? Because this organization understands that mass incarceration is a moral priority. When we understand that young Black men are 21 times more likely to lose their lives at the hands of the police, this is a moral priority. When we understand that there are millions under social control in our prisons and jails, mass incarceration, certainly policing, is a moral priority. When we think about the fact that literally police homicide is a leading cause of death among Black men, not unlike hypertension, not unlike cardiovascular disease, not unlike kidney disease, not unlike the maladies that afflict the poor, this is a moral priority. This is not a matter of Democrats and Republicans, but a matter of right and wrong. And so we yet believe that there is work to do. So when we celebrate Juneteenth, it's not a holiday off from work. It is literally a Sabbath dedicated to social justice. The same legislative body that has passed this legislation so commendably has not yet acted on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would restore the Voting Rights Act in terms of preclearance, in terms of the power to protect the American voters that was stripped away through a decision entitled Shelby versus Holder. That same legislative body has not acted, and that suggests to us that we have work to do. The same body which has not responded to the For the People Act, which would help us have early voting, help us and standardize, if you will, access to the ballot box and voting in this country. Again, not partisan, again, not Republican, again, not Democrat, not independent, but in fact, moral and right and just. This suggests to us that we have work to do. Second point here that I just want to lift up is a point that I touched on earlier, which is Juneteenth must become for us an American Passover. And what I mean by that is we understand as Christians, as heir to the Jewish tradition of Passover, with Passover, when you celebrate Passover, it is not a dry recitation of history in the distant past. The Passover story is told in the present tense. It is a story told about freedom in this moment, escaping bondage in this moment. And so when we celebrate Juneteenth, and because you literally, I want you all to hear this, because you literally are forerunners. Before the Senate acted, before the House acted, United Methodist women decided to make this a holiday. You chose to do so. And in so doing, you've set a moral standard. You've articulated a moral standard for the rest of the country. And I want to suggest to you, that means you can help us provide a theological context for Juneteenth, which is to say it must be a Passover. We must understand this not merely in terms of the past, but the present. And lastly, I just want to end, and I was told to limit my remarks to 15 minutes or so, and I may be at 14 and a half minutes, but I just have to end on a word of hope. I'm reminded that the reason Juneteenth is so powerful is because it comes, if you will, as a semi-culmination of the abolitionist movement. That is to say, those men, women, people who struggled to secure the freedom of 4 million people in bondage. I believe this is a cause and occasion and a celebration of hope. And what I mean by this is, if we recall the story of Harriet Tubman, you recall that Harriet Tubman escaped to freedom, but history tells us that she returned over and over and over again into slavery holding territory, crossing the Mason-Dixon line, going back into Egypt again and again and again to deliver her people to freedom. History tells us that Harriet Tubman delivered 70 or so people to freedom. Now, the question I want to pose to you as United Methodist women is, what would have happened had Harriet Tubman juxtaposed the 70 people she freed to the 4 million who were enslaved? I would suggest to you she might have despaired, she might have become depressed, she might have given up. But Harriet Tubman did not engage in liberation activity, in abolitionist activity, in freedom activity, in prophetic ministry, if you will, as a calculus of reality, but rather as a calculation of faith. And so, in other words, hope is not empirically demonstrated, it is morally chosen. In this moment, each and every Juneteenth is not merely a matter of us counting up our losses and victories. It's not a matter of us looking at the bills we passed or haven't passed in Congress. It's not merely a matter of us counting up our victories at the state or local or neighborhood level. It's a matter of us literally counting the God that we have for us and juxtaposing God's power to the oppression, the bondage that we face. And so when you look at the history of United Methodist women, You look at the people that you have freed, the programs that you brought into being, the children that you have fed, the naked that you have clothed, the ministry that you brought about, the aid that you distributed, the difference that you made, and you think about the God behind all of that, that should inspire you. That should give you hope. And so we cannot in this moment, though we have so much to do, think about what we have lost, what we've not yet won, what victories we not yet secured. We have to have a hope that is based on our God. Again, just a few moments on an incredibly important holiday that you led the nation in celebrating.